I do think that FERC has jurisdiction over the rules for pricing in the wholesale markets. If we don't, we shouldn't even try to regulate wholesale markets. On the other hand, I talked about all the efforts that states are making with renewable portfolio standards and so forth. In the long run, if we don't find a way to have the competitive markets work, that states feel they want to get their power from the competitive markets, they'll just take their ball and go home. As Larry also said, it's voluntary. I mean, states are not forced to be part of a multi-state construct, and if the multi-state constructs don't work for what the state is trying to do, they won't hold. So it's not as simple as just saying we have jurisdiction, that's the end of it. We have to make these markets work in a way that the state resource decisions are somehow getting played in, and that's a pretty complicated enterprise when the state resource decisions are valuing different things than the market is valuing. But that's where I think the work is. I think it's worth doing the work because I think the markets have had a lot of benefits, and I think in some parts of the country, putting Humpty Dumpty back together was almost unfathomably complex. So doing the work to make the markets work for what the states are trying to accomplish, I think will serve us well in the long run. So that's one big area between the states and federal is what are the resource choices and how do the state resource choices work in the competitive markets? Big piece of work for the next several years. The second area that really bears on this is the EPA Clean Power Plan. The Clean Air Act does things by state, state implementation plans, and that's how the Clean Power Plan draft that was released last June is set up. The power markets, of course, do not operate state by state, so I think there will be very considerable, potentially considerable implications for the operation of the markets as the states make all their implementation decisions. I don't know why EPA does things, but I noticed that they gave very high praise to regional efforts where states get together and do things regionally. That, of course, meshes quite well with regional power markets. We see that in New England where all of the 6 states are in RGGI, and ISO New England just assumes RGGI allowances in their dispatch stack, and it's gone on very well for many years. To the extent that states can do things regionally, that will help make this problem easier, but one way or the other, I think we're going to have to think through how state decisions that are made in order to meet an implementation target play in the markets, and that's part of this effort. I also think another big job for FERC and the states is that certainly because of the EPA Clean Power Plan, but also because of the things I mentioned at the top of the speech, the changes in resources, the aging infrastructure, we see, I believe we have a tremendous need for investment in infrastructure in the country. And infrastructure of almost any type does not get built without federal-state cooperation. In transmission, we're starting to see I think the fruits of Order 1000 and the regional processes to plan transmission coming together. I think FERC has taken an important step that has been affirmed by the courts to require regional planning, regional cost allocation, but the states still control where the transmission gets sited, in some cases control who can build the transmission, control the policy drivers that sometimes call for the transmission in the first place to meet state renewable standards. So transmission cannot get built at 888 First Street. It requires an effort between the two big parts of our government. And I think there's a tendency sometimes, by the way, to say like states and federal as if we're kind of a bilateral negotiation, when in fact all the states are in many different places on these things. And but we cannot build the infrastructure that we need to keep the lights on without state-federal cooperation. The second big piece of infrastructure that I think we'll be increasingly needing is to build out our gas pipeline infrastructure. If we as a country are making a pivot to the use of more natural gas for generation, rather than some of the fuels that are not being replenished in the supply mix. We're going to need considerably more pipeline infrastructure in some parts of the country to get that done. While the FERC permits the pipelines, state agencies are very involved. States control whether to allow extraction methodologies in their states, and we need, in many cases, regional buy-in in order to have these projects go forward. And you know, every morning I read my news clips, and they're divided into, first, the ones that, like, a FERC commissioner is quoted in, so I read all the dopey things I said the day before and groan. Then there's usually a big set of articles about the polar vortex and the markets and MOPRs and DR and capacity markets and so forth, and we need more this and we need more that. And then there's a huge set of articles of everyone who's opposed to everything everywhere. Cases against pipelines, people fighting transmission lines, people fighting hydro, and I think, how do I reconcile this first batch of articles with the second batch of articles? And it's going to require the people who are involved in keeping the lights on, both at the state and the federal level, to work together to decide, you know, if we're serious about using more gas for generation, then we need to get the pipelines built or the storage facilities in order to do so. If not, then we have to build whatever resources we need for the other resources we're going to need, but we have to be kind of clear-eyed in what it's going to take. And I think it's going to take significant collaboration and a real push to do the investment in infrastructure that we need. Similar to what we saw maybe in the 80s when the first nuclear wave was being built, not the first, but after the Arab oil embargo and people were getting off oil and there was a major push to kind of get things built. I almost see us going into that sort of cycle again, but with building different things. So that's a little bit of just a scattershot, but as you think about all these things, what resource choices are we going to make? How are the markets going to respect the state choices? How can we make that work? How do we adjust both the markets and the infrastructure for the EPA Clean Power Plan? I think a lot of what we heard today emphasizes that we're doing these things in a very, very complex ecosystem. If you ever try to explain this to people who don't work in energy, and you try to explain, like, what is FERC? What do they even do? I thought there was one right in Boston or Hartford. What is FERC? What do they do? And you have to try to explain the different things their eyes glaze over. Then there's the power marketing and the municipal and the cooperatives and all the different forms of ownership. It's not a system set up where we can say, we as a country are going to move from this to this, and this is how we're going to do it. We have a very messy ecosystem to work in. I go on the assumption that we probably won't have new federal laws passed, that we have to continue to interpret the ones from 1935 and 2005 and 1992 and all the times it's gone along. And I try to be aware of the jurisdictional lines around FERC. That's something I'm very mindful of, but within those jurisdictional lines, I think we have to be willing to make decisions and act, even if they're not popular with everyone, because this is just the complicated ecosystem we have. We can't be paralyzed by the fact that people don't like things, because that's just the system we have. I don't know that we're going to have the state-federal forums that Bob spoke of because of the need for legislation, but I'm very willing to work with NARUC and regional groups and others on some of these issues where cybersecurity, which I haven't talked about, is one, but where federal state have to work together. I think that's essential. As I was listening to the kind of closing of the people talking, I was thinking of the old Beatles song, you know, we'll work it out, because someone said, and I mean, we will work it out, but how well we work it out depends on what we do. And when you look at the triangle that I talked about with reliability, that's not optional. We are going to keep the lights on. That is just essential. That's what we have to do. There's absolutely no, people will cut us no slack. This is an essential product. So that has to happen. Environmental response, I believe that beginning to address climate change is a responsibility of our generation. I know there's not a national consensus on that, but I believe the laws are pointing in that direction, and making environmental progress is on our plate right before us right now. So the third piece of it, cost, how economically we do these things will depend on all the work we do. If we make the markets work, how the regulation works, how the state and federal plans work together, whether states in a region work together, because we're going to keep the lights on, because you have to do what you have to do, but how well we do it while meeting environmental aspirations really depends on all this geeky regulatory stuff that we do for a living. So that's what gets me up in the morning, and I think I'm within just about in my half hour, so thank you very much. I know it's 1:30, but I'm happy to take a few questions. Yes, hi. Can you identify yourself if you, yeah, sorry. I'm doing Sarah's job. Identify yourself at the start of the question, yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm Lori Aniti. I work for the Energy Information Administration on forecasting electricity prices.
Yes,
and
Adam and his whole gang do
yes.
great work for us, yeah.
Thank you. So I have a question. You said this was just the start of a huge infrastructure building, and I was just wondering, we just had a huge increase in transmission infrastructure investment. We've had a huge increase in distribution infrastructure investment with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And so a lot of people where we are thinking, well, it's kind of starting to come to an end. So as far as the huge increase, do you see that, or do you think it's
well, I think I misspoke if I said it's just starting, because we've seen increased transmission investment for the last several years. I think that if you look at many of the competitive markets, however, they're seeing needs for generation that they haven't seen really in this level for decades. And I think the level of gas pipeline investment we're seeing, while not unprecedented, is very sustained. So we're not really at the beginning, but I think if we're going to keep the lights on and meet our environmental objectives, it will require more than we have now.
So sustained investment.
Yes. Mitzi? Yeah. Thank you for having such a big name tag that I can even read.
I bring it with me. Everybody else can. It's renewable. I don't understand why other people don't, because I always say. Anyway, I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. You gave a terrific talk. Could someone read that on your website? When I was responsible, part of the responsibility of getting the line in Bush's State of the Union, the nation has a problem, we're addicted to oil, and ran an energy conversation for 3.5 years. And one of your predecessors was part of our group. And I'd never heard of FERC.